The Analytic of Concepts, Chapter 2, The Deduction of the Pure Concepts of Understanding. Section 1, The Principles of Any Transcendental Deduction. Jurists, when speaking of rights and claims, distinguish in a legal action the question of right from the question of fact, and they demand that both be proved. Proof of the former, which has to state the right or the legal claim, they entitle the deduction. Many empirical concepts are employed without question from anyone. Since experience is always available for the proof of their objective reality, we believe ourselves, even without a deduction, to be justified in appropriating to them a meaning and ascribed significance. But there are also usurpatory concepts, such as fortune, fate, which, though allowed to circulate by almost universal indulgence, are yet from time to time challenged by the question, quid juris? This demand for a deduction involves us in considerable perplexity, no clear legal title sufficient to justify their employment being obtainable either from experience or from reason. Now, among the manifold concepts which form the highly complicated web of human knowledge, there are some which are marked out for pure a priori employment, in complete independence of all experience, and their right to be so employed always demands a deduction. For since empirical proofs do not suffice to justify this kind of employment, we are faced by the problem how these concepts can relate to objects which they yet do not obtain from any experience. The explanation of the manner in which concepts can thus relate a priori to objects I entitle their transcendental deduction, and from it I distinguish empirical deduction, which shows the manner in which a concept is acquired through experience and through reflection upon experience, and which therefore concerns not its legitimacy, but only its de facto mode of origination. We are already in possession of concepts which are of two quite different kinds, and which yet agree in that they relate to objects in a completely a priori manner, namely the concepts of space and time as forms of sensibility, and the categories as concepts of understanding. To seek an empirical deduction of either of these types of concept would be labor entirely lost. For their distinguishing feature consists just in this, that they relate to their objects without having borrowed from experience anything that can serve in the representation of these objects. If, therefore, a deduction of such concepts is indispensable, it must in any case be transcendental. We can, however, with regard to these concepts, as with regard to all knowledge, seek to discover in experience, if not the principle of their possibility, at least the occasioning causes of their production. The impressions of the senses supplying the first stimulus, the whole faculty of knowledge opens out to them, and experience is brought into existence. That experience contains two very dissimilar elements, namely the matter of knowledge from the senses, and a certain form for the ordering of this matter, from the inner source of the pure intuition and thought which, on occasion of the sense impressions, are first brought into action and yield concepts. Such an investigation of the first strivings of our faculty of knowledge, whereby it advances from particular perceptions to universal concepts, is undoubtedly of great service. We are indebted to the celebrated Locke for opening out this new line of inquiry. But a deduction of the pure a priori concepts can never be obtained in this manner. It is not to be looked for in any such direction. For in view of their subsequent employment, which has to be entirely independent of experience, they must be in a position to show a certificate of birth quite other than that of descent from experiences. Since this attempted physiological derivation concerns a quaestio facti, it cannot strictly be called deduction. I shall therefore entitle it the explanation of the possession of pure knowledge. Plainly, the only deduction that can be given of this knowledge is one that is transcendental, not empirical. In respect to pure a priori concepts, the latter type of deduction is an utterly useless enterprise, which can be engaged in only by those who have failed to grasp the quite peculiar nature of these modes of knowledge. But although it may be admitted that the only kind of deduction of pure a priori knowledge which is possible is on transcendental lines, it is not at once obvious that a deduction is indispensably necessary. We have already, by means of a transcendental deduction, traced the concepts of space and time to their sources, and have explained and determined their a priori objective validity. Geometry, however, proceeds with security and knowledge that is completely a priori, and has no need to beseech philosophy for any certificate of the pure and legitimate descent of its fundamental concept of space. But the concept is employed in this science only in its reference to the outer sensible world, of the intuition of which space is the pure form, where all geometrical knowledge, grounded as it is in a priori intuition, possesses immediate evidence. The objects, so far as their form is concerned, are given through the very knowledge of them a priori in intuition. In the case of the pure concepts of understanding, it is quite otherwise. It is with them that the unavoidable demand for a transcendental deduction, not only of themselves, but also of the concept of space, first originates. For since they speak of objects through predicates not of intuition and sensibility, but of pure a priori thought, they relate to objects universally, that is, apart from all conditions of sensibility. Also, not being grounded in experience, they cannot, in a priori intuition, exhibit any object such as might, prior to all experience, serve as ground for their synthesis. For these reasons, they arouse suspicion not merely in regard to the objective validity and to the limits of their own employment, but owing to their tendency to employ the concept of space beyond the conditions of sensible intuition, that concept also they render ambiguous. And this, indeed, is why we have already found a transcendental deduction of it necessary. The reader must therefore be convinced of the unavoidable necessity of such a transcendental deduction before he has taken a single step in the field of pure reason. Otherwise, he proceeds blindly, and after manifold wonderings must come back to the same ignorance from which he started. At the same time, if he is not to lament over obscurity in matters which are by their very nature deeply veiled, or to be too easily discouraged in the removal of obstacles, he must have a clear foreknowledge of the inevitable difficulty of the undertaking. For we must either completely surrender all claims to make judgments of pure reason in the most highly esteemed of all fields, that which transcends the limits of all possible experience, or else bring this critical inquiry to completion. We have already been able, with but little difficulty, to explain how the concepts of space and time, although a priori modes of knowledge, must necessarily relate to objects, and how independently of all experience they make possible a synthetic knowledge of objects. For since only by means of such pure forms of sensibility can an object appear to us, and so be an object of empirical intuition, space and time are pure intuitions which contain a priori the condition of the possibility of objects as appearances, and the synthesis which takes place in them has objective validity. The categories of understanding, on the other hand, do not represent the conditions under which objects are given in intuition. Objects may, therefore, appear to us without their being under the necessity of being related to the functions of understanding. And understanding need not, therefore, contain their a priori conditions. Thus, a difficulty such as we did not meet with in the field of sensibility is here presented, namely, how subjective conditions of thought can have objective validity, that is, can furnish conditions of the possibility of all knowledge of objects. For appearances can certainly be given in intuition independently of functions of the understanding. Let us take, for instance, the concept of cause, which signifies a special kind of synthesis, whereby upon something, A, there is posited something quite different, B, according to a rule. It is not manifest a priori why appearances should contain anything of this kind. Experiences cannot be cited in its proof, for what has to be established is the objective validity of a concept that is a priori. And it is therefore a priori doubtful whether such a concept be not perhaps altogether empty, and have no object anywhere among appearances. That objects of sensible intuition must conform to the formal conditions of sensibility which lie a priori in the mind is evident, because otherwise they would not be objects for us. But that they must likewise conform to the conditions which the understanding requires for the synthetic unity of thought is a conclusion the grounds of which are by no means so obvious. Appearances might very well be so constituted that the understanding should not find them to be in accordance with the conditions of its unity. Everything might be in such confusion that, for instance, in the series of appearances, nothing presented itself which might yield a rule of synthesis, and so answer to the concept of cause and effect. This concept would then be altogether empty, null, and meaningless. But since intuition stands in no need whatsoever of the functions of thought, appearances would nonetheless present objects to our intuition. If we thought to escape these toilsome inquiries by saying that experience continually presents examples of such regularity among appearances, and so affords abundant opportunity of abstracting the concept of cause, and at the same time of verifying the objective validity of such a concept, we should be overlooking the fact that the concept of cause can never arise in this manner. It must either be grounded completely a priori in the understanding, or must be entirely given up as a mere phantom of the brain. For this concept makes strict demand that something, A, should be such that something else, B, follows from it necessarily and in accordance with an absolutely universal rule. Appearances do indeed present cases from which a rule can be obtained according to which something usually happens, but they never prove the sequence to be necessary. To the synthesis of cause and effect there belongs a dignity which cannot be empirically expressed, namely, that the effect not only succeeds upon the cause, but that it is posited through it and arises out of it. This strict universality of the rule is never a characteristic of empirical rules. They can acquire through induction only comparative universality, that is, extensive applicability. If we were to treat pure concepts of understanding as merely empirical products, we should be making a complete change in the manner of their employment. Transition to the transcendental deduction of the categories. There are only two possible ways in which synthetic representations and their objects can establish connection, obtain necessary relation to one another, and, as it were, meet one another. Either the object alone must make the representation possible, or the representation alone must make the object possible. In the former case, this relation is only empirical, and the representation is never possible a priori. This is true of appearances, as regards that element in them which belongs to sensation. In the latter case, representation in itself does not produce its object, insofar as existence is concerned, for we are not here speaking of its causality by means of the will. Nonetheless, the representation is a priori determinate of the object, if it be the case that only through the representation is it possible to know anything as an object. Now, there are two conditions under which alone the knowledge of an object is possible. First, intuition, through which it is given, though only as appearance. Secondly, concept, through which an object is thought corresponding to this intuition. It is evident from the above that the first condition, namely, that under which alone objects can be intuited, does actually lie a priori in the mind as the formal ground of the objects. All appearances necessarily agree with this formal condition of sensibility, since only through it can they appear, that is, be empirically intuited and given. The question now arises whether a priori concepts do not also serve as antecedent conditions under which alone anything can be, if not intuited, yet thought as object in general. In that case, all empirical knowledge of objects would necessarily conform to such concepts, because only as thus presupposing them is anything possible as object of experience. Now, all experience does indeed contain, in addition to the intuition of the senses through which something is given, a concept of an object as being thereby given, that is to say, as appearing. Concepts of objects in general thus underlie all empirical knowledge, as its a priori conditions. The objective validity of the categories as a priori concepts rests, therefore, on the fact that, so far as the form of thought is concerned, through them alone does experience become possible. They relate of necessity and a priori to objects of experience, for the reason that only by means of them can any object whatsoever of experience be thought. The transcendental deduction of all a priori concepts has thus a principle according to which the whole inquiry must be directed, namely, that they must be recognized as a priori conditions of the possibility of experience, alike of the intuition which is to be met within it, and of the thought. Concepts which yield the objective ground of the possibility of experience are for this very reason necessary. But the unfolding of the experience wherein they are encountered is not their deduction. It is only their illustration. For on any such exposition, they would be merely accidental. Save through their original relation to possible experience, in which all objects of knowledge are found, their relation to any one object would be quite incomprehensible. The illustrious Locke, failing to take account of these considerations, and meeting with pure concepts of the understanding and experience, deduced them also from experience, and yet proceeded so inconsequently that he attempted with their aid to obtain knowledge which far transcends all limits of experience. David Hume recognized that, in order to be able to do this, it was necessary that these concepts should have an a priori origin. But since he could not explain how it can be possible that the understanding must think concepts, which are not in themselves connected in the understanding, as being necessarily connected in the object, and since it never occurred to him that the understanding might itself, perhaps, through these concepts, be the author of the experience in which its objects are found, he was constrained to derive them from experience, namely from a subjective necessity, that is, from custom, which arises from repeated association in experience, and which comes mistakenly to be regarded as objective. But from these premises he argued quite consistently. It is impossible, he declared, with these concepts and the principles to which they give rise, to pass beyond the limits of experience. Now this empirical derivation, in which both philosophers agree cannot be reconciled with the scientific a priori knowledge which we do actually possess, namely pure mathematics and general science of nature, and this fact therefore suffices to disprove such derivation. While the former of these two illustrious men opened a wide door to enthusiasm, for if reason once be allowed such rights, it will no longer allow itself to be kept within bounds by vaguely defined recommendations of moderation, the other gave himself over entirely to skepticism, having, as he believed, discovered that what had hitherto been regarded as reason was but an all-prevalent illusion infecting our faculty of knowledge. We now propose to make trial whether it be not possible to find for human reason safe conduct between these two rocks, assigning to her determinate limits, and yet keeping open for her the whole field of her appropriate activities. But first I shall introduce a word of explanation in regard to the categories. They are concepts of an object in general, by means of which the intuition of an object is regarded as determined in respect of one of the logical functions of judgment. Thus the function of the categorical judgment is that of the relation of subject to predicate. For example, all bodies are divisible. But as regards the merely logical employment of the understanding, it remains undetermined to which of the two concepts the function of the subject, and to which the function of predicate, is to be assigned. For we can also say something divisible is a body. But when the concept of body is brought under the category of substance, it is thereby determined that its empirical intuition and experience must always be considered as subject and never as mere predicate. Similarly with all the other categories. Section 2. The a priori grounds of the possibility of experience. That a concept, although itself neither contained in the concept of possible experience, nor consisting of elements of a possible experience, should be produced completely a priori and should relate to an object, is altogether contradictory and impossible. for it would then have no content, since no intuition corresponds to it, and intuitions in general, through which objects can be given to us, constitute the field, the whole object of possible experience. An a priori concept which did not relate directly to experience would be only the logical form of a concept, not the concept itself through which something is thought. Pure a priori concepts, if such exist, cannot indeed contain anything empirical. Yet, nonetheless, they can serve solely as a priori conditions of a possible experience. Upon this ground alone can their objective reality rest. If, therefore, we seek to discover how pure concepts of understanding are possible, we must inquire what are the a priori conditions upon which the possibility of experience rests, and which remain as its underlying grounds when everything empirical is abstracted from appearances. A concept which universally and adequately expresses such a formal and objective condition of experience would be entitled a pure concept of understanding. Certainly, once I am in possession of pure concepts of understanding, I can think objects which may be impossible, or which, though perhaps in themselves possible, cannot be given in any experience. For in the connecting of these concepts, something may be omitted, which yet necessarily belongs to the condition of a possible experience, as in the concept of a spirit. Or it may be, pure concepts are extended further than experience can follow, as with the concept of God. But the elements of all modes of a priori knowledge, even of capricious and incongruous fictions, though they cannot, indeed, be derived from experience, since in that case they would not be knowledge a priori, must nonetheless always contain the pure a priori conditions of a possible experience and of an empirical object. Otherwise, nothing would be thought through them, and they themselves, being without data, could never arise even in thought. The concepts which thus contain a priori the pure thought involved in every experience we find in the categories. If we can prove that by their means alone an object can be thought, this will be a sufficient deduction of them, and will justify their objective validity. But since in such a thought more than simply the faculty of thought, the understanding is brought into play, and since this faculty itself, as a faculty of knowledge that is meant to relate to objects, calls for explanation in regard to the possibility of such relation, we must first of all consider, not in their empirical, but in their transcendental constitution, the subjective sources which form the a priori foundation of the possibility of experience. If each representation were completely foreign to every other, standing apart in isolation, no such thing as knowledge would ever arise. For knowledge is essentially a whole in which representations stand compared and connected. As sense contains a manifold in its intuition, I ascribe to it a synopsis. But to such synopsis, a synthesis must always correspond. Receptivity can make knowledge possible only when combined with spontaneity. Now, this spontaneity is the ground of a threefold synthesis, which must necessarily be found in all knowledge. Namely, the apprehension of representations as modifications of the mind in intuition, their reproduction in imagination, and their recognition in a concept. These point to three subjective sources of knowledge which make possible the understanding itself, and consequently all experience as its empirical product. Preliminary remark. The deduction of the categories is a matter of such extreme difficulty, compelling us to penetrate so deeply into the first grounds of the possibility of our knowledge in general, that in order to avoid the elaborateness of a complete theory, and yet at the same time to omit nothing in so indispensable an inquiry, I have found it advisable in the four following passages rather to prepare than to instruct the reader. Systematic exposition of these elements of the understanding is first given in section 3, immediately following. The reader must not therefore be deterred by obscurities in these earlier sections. They are unavoidable in an enterprise never before attempted. They will, as I trust, in the section referred to, finally give way to complete insight. The synthesis of apprehension in intuition. Whatever the origin of our representations, whether they are due to the influence of outer things or are produced through inner causes, whether they arise a priori or, being appearances, have an empirical origin, they must all, as modifications of the mind, belong to inner sense. All our knowledge is thus finally subject to time, the formal condition of inner sense. In it they must all be ordered, connected, and brought into relation. This is a general observation which, throughout what follows, must be borne in mind as being quite fundamental. Every intuition contains in itself a manifold, which can be represented as a manifold only insofar as the mind distinguishes the time in the sequence of one impression upon another. For each representation, insofar as it is contained in a single moment, can never be anything but absolute unity. In order that unity of intuition may arise out of this manifold, as is required in the representation of space, it must first be run through and held together. This act I name the synthesis of apprehension, because it is directed upon intuition, which does indeed offer a manifold, but a manifold which can never be represented as a manifold, and as contained in a single representation, save in virtue of such a synthesis. This synthesis of apprehension must also be exercised a priori, that is, in respect of representations which are not empirical. For without it, we should never have a priori the representations either of space or of time. They can be produced only through the synthesis of the manifold, which sensibility presents in its original receptivity. We have thus a pure synthesis of apprehension. The synthesis of reproduction in imagination. It is a merely empirical law that representations which have often followed or accompanied one another finally become associated, and so are set in a relation whereby, even in the absence of the object, one of these representations can, in accordance with a fixed rule, bring about a transition of the mind to the other. But this law of reproduction presupposes that appearances are themselves actually subject to such a rule, and that in the manifold of these representations, a coexistence or sequence takes place in conformity with certain rules. Otherwise, our empirical imagination would never find opportunity for exercise appropriate to its powers, and so would remain concealed within the mind as a dead and to us unknown faculty. If cinnabar were sometimes red, sometimes black, sometimes light, sometimes heavy, if a man changed sometimes into this and sometimes into that animal form, if the country on the longest day were sometimes covered with fruit, sometimes with ice and snow, my empirical imagination would never find opportunity when representing red color to bring to mind heavy cinnabar. Nor could there be an empirical synthesis of reproduction if a certain name were sometimes given to this, sometimes to that object, or one and the same thing named sometimes in one way, sometimes in another, independently of any rule to which appearances are in themselves subject. There must then be something which, as the a priori ground of a necessary synthetic unity of appearances, makes their reproduction possible. What that something is, we soon discover when we reflect that appearances are not things in themselves, but are the mere play of our representations, and in the end reduce to determinations of inner sense. For if we can show that even our purest a priori intuitions yield no knowledge, save insofar as they contain a combination of the manifold, such as renders a thoroughgoing synthesis of reproduction possible, then this synthesis of imagination is likewise grounded, antecedently to all experience, upon a priori principles. And we must assume a pure transcendental synthesis of imagination as conditioning the very possibility of all experience. For experience as such necessarily presupposes the reproducibility of appearances. When I seek to draw a line in thought, or to think of the time from one noon to another, or even to represent to myself some particular number, obviously the various manifold representations that are involved must be apprehended by me in thought one after the other. But if I were always to drop out of thought the preceding representations, the first parts of the line, the antecedent parts of the time period, or the units in the order represented, and did not reproduce them while advancing to those that follow, a complete representation would never be obtained. None of the above-mentioned thoughts, not even the purest and most elementary representations of space and time, could arise. The synthesis of apprehension is thus inseparably bound up with the synthesis of reproduction, and as the former constitutes the transcendental ground of the possibility of all modes of knowledge whatsoever, of those that are pure a priori no less than of those that are empirical, the reproductive synthesis of the imagination is to be counted among the transcendental acts of the mind. We shall therefore entitle this faculty the transcendental faculty of imagination. The synthesis of recognition in a concept. If we were not conscious that what we think is the same as what we thought a moment before, all reproduction in the series of representations would be useless. For it would in its present state be a new representation which would not in any way belong to the act whereby it was to be gradually generated. The manifold of the representation would never, therefore, form a whole, since it would lack that unity which only consciousness can impart to it. If, in counting, I forget that the units, which now hover before me, have been added to one another in succession, I should never know that a total is being produced through this successive addition of unit to unit, and so would remain ignorant of the number. For the concept of the number is nothing but the consciousness of this unity of synthesis. The word concept might of itself suggest this remark, for this unitary consciousness is what combines the manifold, successively intuited, and thereupon also reproduced, into one representation. This consciousness may often be only faint, so that we do not connect it with the act itself, that is, not in any direct manner with the generation of the representation, but only with the outcome. But notwithstanding these variations, such consciousness, however indistinct, must always be present. Without it, concepts, and therewith knowledge of objects, are altogether impossible. At this point, we must make clear to ourselves what we mean by the expression, an object of representations. We have stated above that appearances are themselves nothing but sensible representations, which, as such and in themselves, must not be taken as objects capable of existing outside our power of representation. What, then, is to be understood when we speak of an object corresponding to, and consequently also distinct from, our knowledge? It is easily seen that this object must be thought only as something in general, equals X, since outside our knowledge we have nothing which we could set over against this knowledge as corresponding to it. Now we find that our thought of the relation of all knowledge to its object carries with it an element of necessity. The object is viewed as that which prevents our modes of knowledge from being haphazard or arbitrary, and which determines them a priori in some definite fashion. For insofar as they are to relate to an object, they must necessarily agree with one another, that is, must possess that unity which constitutes the concept of an object. But it is clear that, since we have to deal only with the manifold of our representations, and since that X, the object, which corresponds to them is nothing to us, being as it is something that has to be distinct from all our representations, the unity which the object makes necessary can be nothing else than the formal unity of consciousness in the synthesis of the manifold of representations. It is only when we have thus produced synthetic unity in the manifold of intuition that we are in a position to say that we know the object. But this unity is impossible if the intuition cannot be generated in accordance with a rule by means of such a function of synthesis as makes the reproduction of the manifold a priori necessary and renders possible a concept in which it is united. Thus we think a triangle as an object, in that we are conscious of the combination of three straight lines according to a rule by which such an intuition can always be represented. This unity of rule determines all the manifold and limits it to conditions which make unity of apperception possible. The concept of this unity is the representation of the object equals X, which I think, through the predicates above mentioned, of a triangle. All knowledge demands a concept, though that concept may indeed be quite imperfect or obscure. But a concept is always, as regards its form, something universal which serves as a rule. The concept of a body, for instance, as the unity of the manifold which is thought through it, serves as a rule in our knowledge of outer appearances. But it can be a rule for intuitions only insofar as it represents in any given appearances the necessary reproduction of their manifold, and thereby the synthetic unity in our consciousness of them. The concept of body in the perception of something outside us necessitates the representation of extension, and therewith representations of impenetrability, shape, etc. All necessity, without exception, is grounded in a transcendental condition. There must, therefore, be a transcendental ground of the unity of consciousness in the synthesis of the manifold of all our intuitions, and consequently also of the concepts of objects in general, and so of all objects of experience, a ground without which it would be impossible to think of any object for our intuitions. For this object is no more than that something, the concept of which expresses such a necessity of synthesis. This original and transcendental condition is no other than transcendental apperception. Consciousness of self, according to the determinations of our state in inner perception, is merely empirical and always changing. No fixed and abiding self can present itself in this flux of inner appearances. Such consciousness is usually named inner sense, or empirical apperception. What has necessarily to be represented as numerically identical cannot be thought as such through empirical data. To render such a transcendental presupposition valid, there must be a condition which precedes all experience, and which makes experience itself possible. There can be in us no modes of knowledge, no connection or unity of one mode of knowledge with another, without that unity of consciousness which precedes all data of intuitions, and by relation to which representation of objects is alone possible. This pure, original, unchangeable consciousness I shall name transcendental apperception. That it deserves this name is clear from the fact that even the purest objective unity, namely that of the a priori concepts, space and time, is only possible through relation of the intuitions to such unity of consciousness. The numerical unity of this apperception is thus the a priori ground of all concepts, just as the manifoldness of space and time is the a priori ground of the intuitions of sensibility. This transcendental unity of apperception forms out of all possible appearances, which can stand alongside one another in one experience, a connection of all these representations according to laws. For this unity of consciousness would be impossible if the mind in knowledge of the manifold could not become conscious of the identity of function whereby it synthetically combines it in one knowledge. The original and necessary consciousness of the identity of the self is thus at the same time a consciousness of an equally necessary unity of the synthesis of all appearances according to concepts, that is, according to rules, which not only make them necessarily reproducible, but also in so doing determine an object for their intuition, that is, the concept of something wherein they are necessarily interconnected. For the mind could never think its identity in the manifoldness of its representations, and indeed think this identity a priori, if it did not have before its eyes the identity of its act, whereby it subordinates all synthesis of apprehension, which is empirical, to a transcendental unity, thereby rendering possible their interconnection according to a priori rules. Now, also, we are in a position to determine more adequately our concept of an object in general. All representations have, as representations, their object, and can themselves in turn become objects of other representations. Appearances are the sole objects which can be given to us immediately, and that in them which relates immediately to the object is called intuition. But these appearances are not things in themselves. They are only representations, which in turn have their object, an object which cannot itself be intuited by us, and which may therefore be named the non-empirical, that is, transcendental object equals X. The pure concept of this transcendental object, which in reality throughout all our knowledge is always one and the same, is what can alone confer upon all our empirical concepts in general relation to an object, that is, objective reality. This concept cannot contain any determinate intuition, and therefore refers only to that unity which must be met within any manifold of knowledge which stands in relation to an object. This relation is nothing but the necessary unity of consciousness, and therefore also of the synthesis of the manifold, through a common function of the mind, which combines it in one representation. Since this unity must be regarded as necessary a priori, otherwise knowledge would be without an object. The relation to a transcendental object, that is, the objective reality of our empirical knowledge, rests on the transcendental law, that all appearances, insofar as through them objects are to be given to us, must stand under these a priori rules of synthetical unity, whereby the interrelating of these appearances in empirical intuition is alone possible. In other words, appearances in experience must stand under the conditions of the necessary unity of apperception, just as in mere intuition they must be subject to the formal conditions of space and of time. Only thus can any knowledge become possible at all. Preliminary explanation of the possibility of the categories as knowledge a priori. There is one single experience in which all perceptions are represented as in thoroughgoing and orderly connection, just as there is only one space and one time in which all modes of appearance and all relation of being or not being occur. When we speak of different experiences, we can refer only to the various perceptions, all of which, as such, belong to one and the same general experience. This thoroughgoing synthetic unity of perceptions is indeed the form of experience. It is nothing else than the synthetic unity of appearances in accordance with concepts. Unity of synthesis according to empirical concepts would be altogether accidental if these latter were not based on a transcendental ground of unity. Otherwise, it would be possible for appearances to crowd in upon the soul, and yet to be such as would never allow of experience. Since connection in accordance with universal and necessary laws would be lacking, all relation of knowledge to objects would fall away. The appearances might, indeed, constitute intuition without thought, but not knowledge, and consequently would be for us as good as nothing. The a priori conditions of a possible experience in general are at the same time conditions of the possibility of objects of experience. Now I maintain that the categories, above cited, are nothing but the conditions of thought in a possible experience, just as space and time are the conditions of intuition for that same experience. They are fundamental concepts by which we think objects in general for appearances, and have therefore a priori objective validity. This is exactly what we desired to prove. But the possibility, indeed the necessity, of these categories rests on the relation in which our entire sensibility, and with it all possible appearances, stand to original apperception. In original apperception, everything must necessarily conform to the conditions of the thoroughgoing unity of self-consciousness, that is, to the universal functions of synthesis, namely, to that synthesis according to concepts in which alone apperception can demonstrate a priori its complete and necessary identity. Thus, the concept of a cause is nothing but a synthesis of that which follows in the time series with other appearances, according to concepts. And without such unity, which has its a priori rule, and which subjects the appearances to itself, no thoroughgoing, universal, and therefore necessary unity of consciousness would be met with in the manifold of perceptions. These perceptions would not then belong to any experience, and consequently would be without an object, merely a blind play of representations, less even than a dream. All attempts to derive these pure concepts of understanding from experience, and so to ascribe to them a merely empirical origin, are entirely vain and useless. I need not insist upon the fact that, for instance, the concept of a cause involves the character of necessity, which no experience can yield. Experience does indeed show that one appearance customarily follows upon another, but not that this sequence is necessary, nor that we can argue a priori and with complete universality from the antecedent, viewed as a condition, to the consequent. But as regards the empirical rule of association, which we must postulate throughout when we assert that everything in the series of events is so subject to rule that nothing ever happens save insofar as something precedes it, on which it universally follows. Upon what, I ask, does this rule, as a law of nature, rest? How is this association itself possible? The ground of the possibility of the association of the manifold, so far as it lies in the object, is named the affinity of the manifold. I therefore ask, how are we to make comprehensible to ourselves the thoroughgoing affinity of appearances, whereby they stand and must stand under unchanging laws? On my principles, it is easily explicable. all possible appearances as representations belong to the totality of a possible self-consciousness. But as self-consciousness is a transcendental representation, numerical identity is inseparable from it and is a priori certain. For nothing can come to our knowledge save in terms of this original apperception. Now, since this identity must necessarily enter into the synthesis of all the manifold of appearances, so far as the synthesis is to yield empirical knowledge, the appearances are subject to a priori conditions, with which the synthesis of their apprehension must be in complete accordance. The representation of a universal condition according to which a certain manifold can be posited in uniform fashion is called a rule, and when it must be so posited, a law. Thus all appearances stand in thoroughgoing connection according to necessary laws, and therefore in a transcendental affinity, of which the empirical is a mere consequence. That nature should direct itself according to our subjective ground of apperception, and should indeed depend upon it in respect of its conformity to law, sounds very strange and absurd. But when we consider that this nature is not a thing in itself, but is merely an aggregate of appearances, so many representations of the mind, we shall not be surprised that we can discover it only in the radical faculty of all our knowledge, namely in transcendental apperception, in that unity on account of which alone it can be entitled object of all possible experience, that is, nature. Nor shall we be surprised that just for this very reason, this unity can be known a priori, and therefore as necessary. Were the unity given in itself independently of the first sources of our thought, this would never be possible. We should not then know of any source from which we could obtain the synthetic propositions asserting such a universal unity of nature. For they would then have to be derived from the objects of nature themselves, and as this could take place only empirically, none but a merely accidental unity could be obtained, which would fall far short of the necessary interconnection that we have in mind when we speak of nature. Transcendental Deduction A. Deduction of the pure concepts of understanding. Section 3. The relation of the understanding to objects in general and the possibility of knowing them a priori. What we have expounded separately and singly in the preceding section, we shall now present in systematic interconnection. There are three subjective sources of knowledge upon which rests the possibility of experience in general and of knowledge of its objects: sense, imagination, and apperception. Each of these can be viewed as empirical, namely in its application to given appearances. But all of them are likewise a priori elements or foundations, which make this empirical employment itself possible. Sense represents appearances empirically in perception, imagination in association and reproduction, apperception in the empirical consciousness of the identity of the reproduced representations with the appearances whereby they were given, that is, in recognition. But all perceptions are grounded a priori in pure intuition, in time the form of their inner intuition as representations, association in pure synthesis of imagination, and empirical consciousness in pure apperception, that is, in the thoroughgoing identity of the self in all possible representations. If now we desire to follow up the inner ground of this connection of the representations to the point upon which they have all to converge in order that they may therein for the first time acquire the unity of knowledge necessary for a possible experience, we must begin with pure apperception. Intuitions are nothing to us and do not in the least concern us if they cannot be taken up into consciousness, in which they may participate either directly or indirectly. In this way alone is any knowledge possible. We are conscious a priori of the complete identity of the self in respect of all representations which can ever belong to our knowledge, as being a necessary condition of the possibility of all representations. For in me they can represent something only insofar as they belong, with all others, to one consciousness, and therefore must be at least capable of being so connected. This principle holds a priori, and may be called the transcendental principle of the unity of all that is manifold in our representations, and consequently also in intuition. Since this unity of the manifold in one subject is synthetic, pure apperception supplies a principle of the synthetic unity of the manifold in all possible intuition. Footnote: this proposition is of great importance and calls for careful consideration. All representations have a necessary relation to a possible empirical consciousness. For if they did not have this, and if it were altogether impossible to become conscious of them, this would practically amount to the admission of their non-existence. But all empirical consciousness has a necessary relation to a transcendental consciousness which precedes all special experience, namely, the consciousness of myself as original apperception. It is therefore absolutely necessary that in my knowledge all consciousness should belong to a single consciousness, that of myself. Here, then, is a synthetic unity of the manifold of consciousness, which is known a priori, and so yields the ground for synthetic a priori propositions which concern pure thought, just as do space and time for the propositions which refer to the form of pure intuition. The synthetic proposition that all the variety of empirical consciousness must be combined in one single self-consciousness is the absolutely first and synthetic principle of our thought in general. But it must not be forgotten that the bare representation I, in relation to all other representations, the collective unity of which it makes possible, is transcendental consciousness. Whether this representation is clear, empirical consciousness, or obscure, or even whether it ever actually occurs, does not here concern us. But the possibility of the logical form of all knowledge is necessarily conditioned by relation to this apperception as a faculty. This synthetic unity presupposes or includes a synthesis, and if the former is to be a priori necessary, the synthesis must also be a priori. The transcendental unity of apperception thus relates to the pure synthesis of imagination as an a priori condition of the possibility of all combination of the manifold in one knowledge. But only the productive synthesis of the imagination can take place a priori. The reproductive rests upon empirical conditions. Thus, the principle of the necessary unity of pure productive synthesis of imagination prior to apperception is the ground of the possibility of all knowledge, especially of experience. We entitle the synthesis of the manifold in imagination transcendental, if without distinction of intuitions it is directed exclusively to the a priori combination of the manifold. And the unity of this synthesis is called transcendental if it is represented as a priori necessary in relation to the original unity of apperception. Since this unity of apperception underlies the possibility of all knowledge, the transcendental unity of the synthesis of imagination is the pure form of all possible knowledge, and by means of it all objects of possible experience must be represented a priori. The unity of apperception in relation to the synthesis of imagination is the understanding, and this same unity, with reference to the transcendental synthesis of the imagination, the pure understanding. In the understanding, there are then pure a priori modes of knowledge, which contain the necessary unity of the pure synthesis of imagination in respect of all possible appearances. These are the categories, that is, the pure concepts of understanding. The empirical faculty of knowledge in man must therefore contain an understanding which relates to all objects of the senses, although only by means of intuition, and of its synthesis through imagination. All appearances, as data for a possible experience, are subject to this understanding. This relation of appearances to possible experience is indeed necessary, for otherwise they would yield no knowledge and would not in any way concern us. We have, therefore, to recognize that pure understanding, by means of the categories, is a formal and synthetic principle of all experiences, and that appearances have a necessary relation to the understanding. We shall now, starting from below, namely with the empirical, strive to make clear the necessary connection in which understanding, by means of the categories, stands to appearances. What is first given to us is appearance. When combined with consciousness, it is called perception. Save through its relation to a consciousness that is at least possible, appearance could never be for us an object of knowledge, and so would be nothing to us. And since it has in itself no objective reality, but exists only in being known, it would be nothing at all. Now, since every appearance contains a manifold, and since different perceptions therefore occur in the mind separately and singly, a combination of them, such as they cannot have in sense itself, is demanded. There must therefore exist in us an active faculty for the synthesis of this manifold. To this faculty I give the title imagination. Its action, when immediately directed upon perceptions, I entitle apprehension. Footnote: psychologists have hitherto failed to realize that imagination is a necessary ingredient of perception itself. This is due partly to the fact that that faculty has been limited to reproduction, partly to the belief that the senses not only supply impressions, but also combine them so as to generate images of objects. For that purpose, something more than the mere receptivity of impressions is undoubtedly required, namely, a function for the synthesis of them. Since imagination has to bring the manifold of intuition into the form of an image, it must previously have taken the impressions up into its activity, that is, have apprehended them. But it is clear that even this apprehension of the manifold would not by itself produce an image and a connection of the impressions, were it not that there exists a subjective ground which leads the mind to reinstate a preceding perception alongside the subsequent perception to which it has passed, and so to form whole series of perceptions. This is the reproductive faculty of imagination, which is merely empirical. If, however, representations reproduced one another in any order, just as they happened to come together, this would not lead to any determinate connection of them, but only to accidental collocations, and so would not give rise to any knowledge. Their reproduction must, therefore, conform to a rule, in accordance with which a representation connects in the imagination with one representation in preference to another. This subjective and empirical ground of reproduction according to rules is what is called the association of representations. Now, if this unity of association had not also an objective ground, which makes it impossible that appearances should be apprehended by the imagination otherwise than under the condition of a possible synthetic unity of this apprehension, it would be entirely accidental that appearances should fit into a connected whole of human knowledge. For even though we should have the power of associating perceptions, it would remain entirely undetermined and accidental whether they would themselves be associable. And should they not be associable, there might exist a multitude of perceptions, and indeed an entire sensibility, in which much empirical consciousness would arise in my mind, but in a state of separation, and without belonging to a consciousness of myself. This, however, is impossible, for it is only because I ascribe all perceptions to one consciousness, original apperception, that I can say of all perceptions that I am conscious of them. There must, therefore, be an objective ground, that is, one that can be comprehended a priori, antecedently to all empirical laws of the imagination, upon which rests the possibility, nay, the necessity, of a law that extends to all appearances, a ground, namely, which constrains us to regard all appearances as data of the senses that must be associable in themselves and subject to universal rules of a thoroughgoing connection in their reproduction. This objective ground of all association of appearances I entitle their affinity. It is nowhere to be found save in the principle of the unity of apperception in respect of all knowledge which is to belong to me. According to this principle, all appearances, without exception, must so enter the mind or be apprehended that they conform to the unity of apperception. Without synthetic unity in their connection, this would be impossible, and such synthetic unity is itself, therefore, objectively necessary. The objective unity of all empirical consciousness in one consciousness, that of original apperception, is thus the necessary condition of all possible perception. And this being recognized, we can prove that the affinity of all appearances, near or remote, is a necessary consequence of a synthesis in imagination which is grounded a priori on rules. Since the imagination is itself a faculty of a priori synthesis, we assign to it the title productive imagination. insofar as it aims at nothing but necessary unity in the synthesis of what is manifold in appearance, it may be entitled the transcendental function of imagination. That the affinity of appearances, and with it their association, and through this in turn their reproduction according to laws, and so as involving these various factors experience itself, should only be possible by means of this transcendental function of imagination, is indeed strange, but is nonetheless an obvious consequence of the preceding argument. For without this transcendental function, no concepts of objects would together make up a unitary experience. The abiding and unchanging I, pure apperception, forms the correlate of all our representations, insofar as it is to be at all possible that we should become conscious of them. All consciousness as truly belongs to an all-comprehensive pure apperception, as all sensible intuition, as representation, does to a pure inner intuition, namely, to time. It is this apperception which must be added to pure imagination in order to render its function intellectual. For since the synthesis of imagination connects the manifold only as it appears in intuition, as for instance in the shape of a triangle, it is, though exercised a priori, always in itself sensible. And while concepts which belong to the understanding are brought into play through relation of the manifold to the unity of apperception, it is only by means of the imagination that they can be brought into relation to sensible intuition. A pure imagination, which conditions all a priori knowledge, is thus one of the fundamental faculties of the human soul. By its means, we bring the manifold of intuition on the one side into connection with the condition of the necessary unity of pure apperception on the other. The two extremes, namely sensibility and understanding, must stand in necessary connection with each other through the mediation of this transcendental function of imagination, because otherwise the former, though indeed yielding appearances, would supply no objects of empirical knowledge, and consequently no experience. Actual experience, which is constituted by apprehension, association, reproduction, and finally recognition of appearances, contains in recognition the last and highest of these merely empirical elements of experience, certain concepts which render possible the formal unity of experience, and therewith all objective validity, truth, of empirical knowledge. These grounds of the recognition of the manifold, so far as they concern solely the form of an experience in general, are the categories. Upon them is based not only all formal unity in the transcendental synthesis of imagination, but also, thanks to that synthesis, all its empirical employment in recognition, reproduction, association, apprehension, in connection with the appearances. For only by means of these fundamental concepts can appearances belong to knowledge, or even to our consciousness, and so to ourselves. Thus the order and regularity in the appearances, which we entitle nature, we ourselves introduce. We could never find them in appearances, had we not ourselves, or the nature of our mind, originally set them there. For this unity of nature has to be a necessary one, that is, has to be an a priori certain unity of the connection of appearances, and such synthetic unity could not be established a priori if there were not subjective grounds of such unity contained a priori in the original cognitive powers of our mind, and if these subjective conditions, inasmuch as they are the grounds of the possibility of knowing any object whatsoever in experience, were not at the same time objectively valid. We have already defined the understanding in various different ways, as a spontaneity of knowledge, in distinction from the receptivity of sensibility, as a power of thought, as a faculty of concepts, or again, of judgments. All these definitions, when they are adequately understood, are identical. We may now characterize it as the faculty of rules. This distinguishing mark is more fruitful and approximates more closely to its essential nature. Sensibility gives us forms of intuition, but understanding gives us rules. The latter is always occupied in investigating appearances in order to detect some rule in them. Rules, so far as they are objective, and therefore necessarily depend upon the knowledge of the object, are called laws. Although we learn many laws through experience, they are only special determinations of still higher laws, and the highest of these, under which the others all stand, issue a priori from the understanding itself. They are not borrowed from experience. On the contrary, they have to confer upon appearances their conformity to law, and so to make experience possible. Thus, the understanding is something more than a power of formulating rules through comparison of appearances. It is itself the lawgiver of nature. Save through it, nature, that is, synthetic unity of the manifold of appearances according to rules, would not exist at all. For appearances, as such, cannot exist outside us. They exist only in our sensibility. And this nature, as object of knowledge in an experience, with everything which it may contain, is only possible in the unity of apperception. The unity of apperception is thus the transcendental ground of the necessary conformity to law of all appearances in one experience. This same unity of apperception in respect to a manifold of representations, determining it out of a unity, acts as the rule, and the faculty of these rules is the understanding. All appearances as possible experiences thus lie a priori in the understanding, and receive from it their formal possibility, just as, insofar as they are mere intuitions, they lie in the sensibility, and are, as regards their form, only possible through it. However exaggerated and absurd it may sound, to say that the understanding is itself the source of the laws of nature, and so of its formal unity, such an assertion is nonetheless correct, and is in keeping with the object to which it refers, namely experience. Certainly, empirical laws as such can never derive their origin from pure understanding. That is as little possible as to understand completely the inexhaustible multiplicity of appearances merely by reference to the pure form of sensible intuition. But all empirical laws are only special determinations of the pure laws of understanding, under which, and according to the norm of which, they first become possible. Through them, appearances take on an orderly character, just as these same appearances, despite the differences of their empirical form, must nonetheless always be in harmony with the pure form of sensibility. Pure understanding is thus in the categories the law of the synthetic unity of all appearances, and thereby first and originally makes experience, as regards its form, possible. This is all that we were called upon to establish in the transcendental deduction of the categories, namely, to render comprehensible this relation of understanding to sensibility, and, by means of sensibility, to all objects of experience. The objective validity of the pure a priori concepts is thereby made intelligible, and their origin and truth determined. Summary representation of the correctness of this deduction of the pure concepts of understanding, and of its being the only deduction possible. If the objects with which our knowledge has to deal were things in themselves, we could have no a priori concepts of them. For from what source could we obtain the concepts? If we derived them from the object, leaving aside the question how the object could become known to us, our concepts would be merely empirical and not a priori. And if we derived them from the self, that which is merely in us could not determine the character of an object distinct from our representations, that is, could not be a ground why a thing should exist characterized by that which we have in our thought, and why such a representation should not, rather, be altogether empty. But if, on the other hand, we have to deal only with appearances, it is not merely possible, but necessary, that certain a priori concepts should precede empirical knowledge of objects. For since a mere modification of our sensibility can never be met with outside us, the objects, as appearances, constitute an object which is merely in us. Now, to assert in this manner that all these appearances, and consequently all objects with which we can occupy ourselves, are one and all in me, that is, are determinations of my identical self, is only another way of saying that there must be a complete unity of them in one and the same apperception. But this unity of possible consciousness also constitutes the form of all knowledge of objects. Through it, the manifold is thought as belonging to a single object. Thus, the mode in which the manifold of sensible representation, intuition, belongs to one consciousness precedes all knowledge of the object as the intellectual form of such knowledge, and itself constitutes a formal a priori knowledge of all objects, so far as they are thought. Categories. the synthesis of the manifold through pure imagination, the unity of all representations in relation to original apperception, precede all empirical knowledge. Pure concepts of understanding are thus a priori possible, and in relation to experience are indeed necessary. And this for the reason that our knowledge has to deal solely with appearances, the possibility of which lies in ourselves, and the connection and unity of which, in the representation of an object, are to be met with only in ourselves. Such connection and unity must therefore precede all experience, and are required for the very possibility of it in its formal aspect. From this point of view, the only feasible one, our deduction of the categories, has been developed. Deduction of the pure concepts of the understanding, as restated in 2nd edition. Section 2. Transcendental deduction of the pure concepts of the understanding. The possibility of combination in general. The manifold of representations can be given in an intuition which is purely sensible, that is, nothing but receptivity, and the form of this intuition can lie a priori in our faculty of representation, without being anything more than the mode in which the subject is affected. But the combination of a manifold in general can never come to us through the senses, and cannot, therefore, be already contained in the pure form of sensible intuition. For it is an act of spontaneity of the faculty of representation. And since this faculty, to distinguish it from sensibility, must be entitled understanding, all combination, be we conscious of it or not, be it a combination of the manifold of intuition, empirical or non-empirical, or of various concepts, is an act of understanding. To this act the general title synthesis may be assigned, as indicating that we cannot represent to ourselves anything as combined in the object which we have not ourselves previously combined, and that of all representations, combination is the only one which cannot be given through objects. Being an act of the self-activity of the subject, it cannot be executed save by the subject itself. It will easily be observed that this action is originally one, and is equipollent for all combination, and that its dissolution, namely analysis, which appears to be its opposite, yet always presupposes it. For where the understanding has not previously combined, it cannot dissolve, since only as having been combined by the understanding can anything that allows of analysis be given to the faculty of representation. But the concept of combination includes, besides the concept of the manifold and of its synthesis, also the concept of the unity of the manifold. Combination is representation of the synthetic unity of the manifold. Footnote: whether the representations are in themselves identical, and whether, therefore, one can be analytically thought through the other, is not a question that here arises. The consciousness of the one, when the manifold is under consideration, has always to be distinguished from the consciousness of the other, and it is with the synthesis of this possible consciousness that we are here alone concerned. The representation of this unity cannot, therefore, arise out of the combination. On the contrary, it is what, by adding itself to the representation of the manifold, first makes possible the concept of the combination. This unity, which precedes a priori all concepts of combination, is not the category of unity, for all categories are grounded in logical functions of judgment, and in these functions combination, and therefore unity of given concepts, is already thought. Thus the category already presupposes combination. We must therefore look yet higher for this unity, namely in that which itself contains the ground of the unity of diverse concepts in judgment, and therefore of the possibility of the understanding, even as regards its logical employment. The original synthetic unity of apperception. It must be possible for the I think to accompany all my representations, for otherwise something would be represented in me which could not be thought at all. That is equivalent to saying that the representation would be impossible, or at least would be nothing to me. That representation which could be given prior to all thought is entitled intuition. All the manifold of intuition has, therefore, a necessary relation to the I think in the same subject in which this manifold is found. But this representation is an act of spontaneity, that is, it cannot be regarded as belonging to sensibility. I call it pure apperception, to distinguish it from empirical apperception, or again, original apperception, because it is that self-consciousness which, while generating the representation, I think, a representation which must be capable of accompanying all other representations, and in which all consciousness is one and the same, cannot itself be accompanied by any further representation. The unity of this apperception I likewise entitle the transcendental unity of self-consciousness, in order to indicate the possibility of a priori knowledge arising from it. For the manifold representations which are given in an intuition would not be one and all my representations if they do not all belong to one self-consciousness. As my representations, even if I am not conscious of them as such, they must conform to the condition under which alone they can stand together in one universal self-consciousness, because otherwise they would not all, without exception, belong to me. From this original combination, many consequences follow. This thoroughgoing identity of the apperception of a manifold, which is given in intuition, contains a synthesis of representations, and is possible only through the consciousness of this synthesis. For the empirical consciousness, which accompanies different representations, is in itself diverse, and without relation to the identity of the subject. That relation comes about not simply through my accompanying each representation with consciousness, but only insofar as I conjoin one representation with another, and am conscious of the synthesis of them. Only insofar, therefore, as I can unite a manifold of given representations in one consciousness, is it possible for me to represent to myself the identity of the consciousness in, that is, throughout, these representations. In other words, the analytic unity of apperception is possible only under the presupposition of a certain synthetic unity. Footnote: the analytic unity of consciousness belongs to all general concepts as such. If, for instance, I think red in general, I thereby represent to myself a property which, as a characteristic, can be found in something, or can be combined with other representations. That is, only by means of a presupposed possible synthetic unity can I represent to myself the analytic unity. A representation which is to be thought as common to different representations is regarded as belonging to such as have, in addition to it, also something different. Consequently, it must previously be thought in synthetic unity with other, though it may be only possible, representations, before I can think in it the analytic unity of consciousness, which makes it a conceptus communis. The synthetic unity of apperception is therefore that highest point to which we must ascribe all employment of the understanding, even the whole of logic, and conformably therewith transcendental philosophy. Indeed, this faculty of apperception is the understanding itself. The thought that the representations given in intuition, one and all, belong to me, is therefore precisely the same as the thought that I unite them in one self-consciousness, or can at least so unite them. And although this thought is not itself the consciousness of the synthesis of the representations, it presupposes the possibility of that synthesis. In other words, only insofar as I can grasp the manifold of the representations in one consciousness do I call them one and all mine. For otherwise I should have as many-colored and diverse a self as I have representations of which I am conscious to myself. Synthetic unity of the manifold of intuitions, as generated a priori, is thus the ground of the identity of apperception itself, which precedes a priori all my determinate thought. Combination does not, however, lie in the objects, and cannot be borrowed from them, and so, through perception, first be taken up into the understanding. On the contrary, it is an affair of the understanding alone, which itself is nothing but the faculty of combining a priori, and of bringing the manifold of given representations under the unity of apperception. The principle of apperception is the highest principle in the whole sphere of human knowledge. This principle of the necessary unity of apperception is itself indeed an identical and therefore analytic proposition. Nevertheless, it reveals the necessity of a synthesis of the manifold given in intuition, without which the thoroughgoing identity of self-consciousness cannot be thought. For through the I, As simple representation, nothing manifold is given. Only an intuition, which is distinct from the I, can a manifold be given. And only through combination in one consciousness can it be thought. An understanding in which through self-consciousness all the manifold would eo ipso be given would be intuitive. Our understanding can only think, and for intuition must look to the senses. I am conscious of the self as identical in respect of the manifold of representations that are given to me in an intuition, because I call them one and all my representations, and so apprehend them as constituting one intuition. This amounts to saying that I am conscious to myself a priori of a necessary synthesis of representations, to be entitled the original synthetic unity of apperception, under which all representations that are given to me must stand, but under which they have also first to be brought by means of a synthesis. The principle of the synthetic unity is the supreme principle of all employment of the understanding. The supreme principle of the possibility of all intuition in its relation to sensibility is, according to the transcendental aesthetic, that all the manifold of intuition should be subject to the formal conditions of space and time. The supreme principle of the same possibility in its relation to understanding is that all the manifold of intuition should be subject to conditions of the original synthetic unity of apperception. Footnote: space and time and all their parts are intuitions, and are therefore, with the manifold which they contain, single representations. See the transcendental aesthetic. Consequently, they are not mere concepts through which one and the same consciousness is found to be contained in a number of representations. On the contrary, through them many representations are found to be contained in one representation, and in the consciousness of that representation, and they are thus composite. The unity of that consciousness is therefore synthetic, and yet is also original. The singleness of such intuitions is found to have important consequences. Insofar as the manifold representations of intuition are given to us, they are subject to the former of these two principles. Insofar as they must allow of being combined in one consciousness, they are subject to the latter. For without such combination, nothing can be thought or known, since the given representations would not have in common the act of the apperception I think, and so could not be apprehended together in one self-consciousness. Understanding is, to use general terms, the faculty of knowledge. This knowledge consists in the determinate relation of given representations to an object, and an object is that in the concept of which the manifold of a given intuition is united. Now all unification of representations demands unity of consciousness in the synthesis of them. Consequently, it is the unity of consciousness that alone constitutes the relation of representations to an object, and therefore their objective validity and the fact that they are modes of knowledge, and upon it therefore rests the very possibility of the understanding. The first pure knowledge of understanding, then, upon which all the rest of its employment is based, and which also at the same time is completely independent of all conditions of sensible intuition, is the principle of the original synthetic unity of apperception. Thus the mere form of outer sensible intuition, space, is not yet by itself knowledge. It supplies only the manifold of a priori intuition for a possible knowledge. To know anything in space, for instance a line, I must draw it, and thus synthetically bring into being a determinate combination of the given manifold, so that the unity of this act is at the same time the unity of consciousness, as in the concept of a line. And it is through this unity of consciousness that an object, a determinate space, is first known. The synthetic unity of consciousness is, therefore, an objective condition of all knowledge. It is not merely a condition that I myself require in knowing an object, but is a condition under which every intuition must stand in order to become an object for me. For otherwise, in the absence of this synthesis, the manifold would not be united in one consciousness. Although this proposition makes synthetic unity a condition of all thought, it is, as already stated, itself analytic. For it says no more than that all my representations in any given intuition must be subject to that condition under which alone I can ascribe them to the identical self as my representations, and so can comprehend them as synthetically combined in one apperception through the general expression, I think. This principle is not, however, to be taken as applying to every possible understanding, but only to that understanding through whose pure apperception, in the representation I am, nothing manifold is given. An understanding which through its self-consciousness could supply to itself the manifold of intuition, an understanding, that is to say, through whose representation the objects of the representation should at the same time exist, would not require, for the unity of consciousness, a special act of synthesis of the manifold. For the human understanding, however, which thinks only and does not intuit, that act is necessary. It is indeed the first principle of the human understanding, and is so indispensable to it that we cannot form the least conception of any other possible understanding, either of such as is itself intuitive, or of any that may possess an underlying mode of sensible intuition which is different in kind from that in space and time. The objective unity of self-consciousness. The transcendental unity of apperception is that unity through which all the manifold given in an intuition is united in a concept of the object. It is therefore entitled objective, and must be distinguished from the subjective unity of consciousness, which is a determination of inner sense, through which the manifold of intuition for such objective combination is empirically given. Whether I can become empirically conscious of the manifold as simultaneous or as successive depends on circumstances or empirical conditions. Therefore, the empirical unity of consciousness, through association of representations, itself concerns an appearance, and is wholly contingent. But the pure form of intuition in time, merely as intuition in general, which contains a given manifold, is subject to the original unity of consciousness, simply through the necessary relation of the manifold of the intuition to the one I think, and so through the pure synthesis of understanding, which is the a priori underlying ground of the empirical synthesis. Only the original unity is objectively valid. The empirical unity of apperception, upon which we are not here dwelling, and which besides is merely derived from the former, under given conditions in concreto, has only subjective validity. To one man, for instance, a certain word suggests one thing, to another some other thing. The unity of consciousness in that which is empirical is not, as regards what is given, necessarily and universally valid. The logical form of all judgments consists in the objective unity of the apperception of the concepts which they contain. I have never been able to accept the interpretation which logicians give of judgment in general. It is, they declare, the representation of a relation between two concepts. I do not here dispute with them as to what is defective in this interpretation, that in any case it applies only to categorical, not to hypothetical and disjunctive judgments, the two latter containing a relation not of concepts but of judgments, an oversight from which many troublesome consequences have followed. Footnote: the lengthy doctrine of the four syllogistic figures concerns categorical syllogisms only, and although it is indeed nothing more than an artificial method of securing, through the surreptitious introduction of immediate inferences among the premises of a pure syllogism, the appearance that there are more kinds of inference than that of the first figure, this would hardly have met with such remarkable acceptance had not its author succeeded in bringing categorical judgments into such exclusive respect as being those to which all others must allow of being reduced, teaching which, as indicated in section 9, is nonetheless erroneous. I need only point out that the definition does not determine in what the asserted relation consists. But if I investigate more precisely the relation of the given modes of knowledge in any judgment, and distinguish it as belonging to the understanding, from the relation according to laws of the reproductive imagination, which has only subjective validity, I find that a judgment is nothing but the manner in which the given modes of knowledge are brought to the objective unity of apperception. This is what is intended by the copula is. It is employed to distinguish the objective unity of given representations from the subjective. It indicates their relation to original apperception and their necessary unity. It holds good even if the judgment is itself empirical and therefore contingent, as, for example, in the judgment, bodies are heavy. I do not here assert that these representations necessarily belong to one another in the empirical intuition, but that they belong to one another in virtue of the necessary unity of apperception in the synthesis of intuitions, that is, according to principles of the objective determination of all representations, insofar as knowledge can be acquired by means of those representations, principles which are all derived from the fundamental principle of the transcendental unity of apperception. Only in this way does there arise from this relation a judgment, that is, a relation which is objectively valid, and so can be adequately distinguished from a relation of the same representations that would have only subjective validity, as when they are connected according to laws of association. In the latter case, all that I could say would be, if I support a body, I feel an impression of weight. I could not say, the body, is heavy. Thus, to say the body is heavy is not merely to state that the two representations have always been conjoined in my perception, however often that perception be repeated. What we are asserting is that they are combined in the object, no matter what the state of the subject may be. All sensible intuitions are subject to the categories, as conditions under which alone their manifold can come together in one consciousness. The manifold given in a sensible intuition is necessarily subject to the original synthetic unity of apperception, because in no other way is the unity of intuition possible. But that act of understanding by which the manifold of given representations, be they intuitions or concepts, is brought under one apperception, is the logical function of judgment. All the manifold, therefore, so far as is given in a single empirical intuition, is determined in respect of one of the logical functions of judgment, and is thereby brought into one consciousness. Now, the categories are just these functions of judgment, insofar as they are employed in determination of the manifold of a given intuition. Consequently, the manifold in a given intuition is necessarily subject to the categories. Observation. A manifold, contained in an intuition which I call mine, is represented, by means of the synthesis of the understanding, as belonging to the necessary unity of self-consciousness, and this is effected by means of the category. Footnote: the proof of this rests on the represented unity of intuition, by which an object is given. This unity of intuition always includes in itself a synthesis of the manifold given for an intuition, and so already contains the relation of this manifold to the unity of apperception. This requirement of a category therefore shows that the empirical consciousness of a given manifold in a single intuition is subject to a pure self-consciousness a priori, just as is empirical intuition to a pure sensible intuition, which likewise takes place a priori. Thus, in the above proposition, a beginning is made of a deduction of the pure concepts of understanding, and in this deduction, since the categories have their source in the understanding alone, independently of sensibility, I must abstract from the mode in which the manifold for an empirical intuition is given, and must direct attention solely to the unity which, in terms of the category, and by means of the understanding, enters into the intuition. In what follows, it will be shown, from the mode in which the empirical intuition is given in sensibility, that its unity is no other than that which the category, according to section 20, prescribes to the manifold of any given intuition. Only thus, by demonstration of the a priori validity of the categories in respect of all objects of our senses, will the purpose of the deduction be fully attained. But in the above proof, there is one feature from which I could not abstract. The feature, namely, that the manifold to be intuited must be given prior to the synthesis of understanding, and independently of it. How this takes place remains here undetermined. For were I to think an understanding which is itself intuitive, as, for example, a divine understanding which should not represent to itself given objects, but through whose representation the objects should themselves be given or produced, the categories would have no meaning whatsoever in respect of such a mode of knowledge. They are merely rules for an understanding whose whole power consists in thought, that is, in the act whereby it brings the synthesis of a manifold, given to it from elsewhere in intuition, to the unity of apperception. A faculty, therefore, which by itself knows nothing whatsoever, but merely combines and arranges the material of knowledge, that is, the intuition, which must be given to it by the object. This peculiarity of our understanding, that it can produce a priori unity of apperception solely by means of the categories, and only by such and so many, is as little capable of further explanation as why we have just these and no other functions of judgment, or why space and time are the only forms of our possible intuition. The category has no other application in knowledge than to objects of experience. To think an object and to know an object are thus by no means the same thing. Knowledge involves two factors. First, the concept, through which an object in general is thought, the category, and secondly, the intuition, through which it is given. For if no intuition could be given corresponding to the concept would still indeed be a thought, so far as its form is concerned, but would be without any object, and no knowledge of anything would be possible by means of it. So far as I could know, there would be nothing, and could be nothing, to which my thought could be applied. Now, as the aesthetic has shown, the only intuition possible to us is sensible. Consequently, the thought of an object in general, by means of a pure concept of understanding, can become knowledge for us only insofar as the concept is related to objects of the senses. Sensible intuition is either pure intuition, space and time, or empirical intuition of that which is immediately represented, through sensation, as actual in space and time. Through the determination of pure intuition, we can acquire a priori knowledge of objects, as in mathematics, but only in regard to their form, as appearances. Whether there can be things which must be intuited in this form is still left undecided. Mathematical concepts are not, therefore, by themselves knowledge, except on the supposition that there are things which allow of being presented to us only in accordance with the form of that pure sensible intuition. Now, things in space and time are given only insofar as they are perceptions, that is, representations accompanied by sensation, therefore only through empirical representation. Consequently, the pure concepts of understanding, even when they are applied to a priori intuitions, as in mathematics, yield knowledge only insofar as these intuitions, and therefore indirectly by their means the pure concepts also, can be applied to empirical intuitions. Even, therefore, with the aid of pure intuition, the categories do not afford us any knowledge of things. They do so only through their possible application to empirical intuition. In other words, they serve only for the possibility of empirical knowledge, and such knowledge is what we entitle experience. Our conclusion is therefore this: the categories, as yielding knowledge of things, have no kind of application save only in regard to things which may be objects of possible experience. The above proposition is of the greatest importance, for it determines the limits of the employment of the pure concepts of understanding in regard to objects, just as the transcendental aesthetic determined the limits of the employment of the pure form of our sensible intuition. Space and time, as conditions under which alone objects can possibly be given to us, are valid no further than for objects of the senses, and therefore only for experience. Beyond these limits they represent nothing, for they are only in the senses, and beyond them have no reality. The pure concepts of understanding are free from this limitation, and extend to objects of intuition in general, be the intuition like or unlike ours, if only it be sensible and not intellectual. But this extension of concepts beyond our sensible intuition is of no advantage to us, for as concepts of objects they are then empty, and do not even enable us to judge of their objects whether or not they are possible. They are mere forms of thought, without objective reality, since we have no intuition at hand to which the synthetic unity of apperception, which constitutes the whole content of these forms, could be applied, and in being so applied determine an object. Only our sensible and empirical intuition can give to them body and meaning. If we suppose an object of a non-sensible intuition to be given, we can indeed represent it through all the predicates which are implied in the presupposition that it has none of the characteristics proper to sensible intuition, that it is not extended or in space, that its duration is not a time, that no change, succession of determinations in time, is to be met within it, etc. But there is no proper knowledge if I thus merely indicate what the intuition of an object is not, without being able to say what it is that is contained in the intuition. For I have not then shown that the object which I am thinking through my pure concept is even so much as possible, not being in a position to give any intuition corresponding to the concept, and being able only to say that our intuition is not applicable to it. But what has chiefly to be noted is this, that to such a something in general, not a single one of all the categories could be applied. We could not, for instance, apply to it the concept of substance, meaning something which can exist as subject and never as mere predicate. For save insofar as empirical intuition provides the instance to which to apply it, I do not know whether there can be anything that corresponds to such a form of thought. But of this more hereafter. The application of the categories to objects of the senses in general. The pure concepts of understanding relate, through the mere understanding, to objects of intuition in general, whether that intuition be our own or any other, provided only it be sensible. The concepts are, however, for this very reason, mere forms of thought, through which alone no determinate object is known. The synthesis or combination of the manifold in them relates only to the unity of apperception, and is thereby the ground of the possibility of a priori knowledge, so far as such knowledge rests on the understanding. This synthesis, therefore, is at once transcendental and also purely intellectual. But since there lies in us a certain form of a priori sensible intuition, which depends on the receptivity of the faculty of representation, sensibility, the understanding, as spontaneity, is able to determine inner sense through the manifold of given representations, in accordance with the synthetic unity of apperception, and so to think synthetic unity of the apperception of the manifold of a priori sensible intuition, that being the condition under which all objects of our human intuition must necessarily stand. In this way the categories, in themselves mere forms of thought, obtain objective reality, that is, application to objects which can be given us in intuition. These objects, however, are only appearances, for it is solely of appearances that we can have a priori intuition. This synthesis of the manifold of sensible intuition, which is possible and necessary a priori, may be entitled figurative synthesis, to distinguish it from the synthesis which is thought in the mere category in respect of the manifold of an intuition in general, and which is entitled combination through the understanding. Both are transcendental, not merely as taking place a priori, but also as conditioning the possibility of other a priori knowledge. But the figurative synthesis, if it be viewed merely in its relation to the original synthetic unity of apperception, that is, to the transcendental unity which is thought in the categories, must, in order to be distinguished from the merely intellectual combination, be called the transcendental synthesis of imagination. Imagination is the faculty of representing in intuition an object that is not itself present. Now, since all our intuition is sensible, the imagination, owing to the subjective condition under which alone it can give to the concepts of understanding a corresponding intuition, belongs to sensibility. But inasmuch as its synthesis is an expression of spontaneity, which is determinative and not, like sense, determinable merely, and which is therefore able to determine sense a priori in respect of its form in accordance with the unity of apperception, imagination is to that extent a faculty which determines the sensibility a priori, and its synthesis of intuitions, conforming as it does to the categories, must be the transcendental synthesis of imagination. This synthesis is an action of the understanding on the sensibility, and is its first application, and thereby the ground of all its other applications to the objects of our possible intuition. As figurative, it is distinguished from the intellectual synthesis, which is carried out by the understanding alone, without the aid of the imagination. Insofar as imagination is spontaneity, I sometimes also entitle it the productive imagination, to distinguish it from the reproductive imagination, whose synthesis is entirely subject to empirical laws, the laws, namely, of association, and which therefore contributes nothing to the explanation of the possibility of a priori knowledge. Reproductive synthesis falls within the domain not of transcendental philosophy, but of psychology. This is a suitable place for explaining the paradox which must have been obvious to everyone in our exposition of the form of inner sense, namely, that the sense represents to consciousness even our own selves only as we appear to ourselves, and not as we are in ourselves. For we intuit ourselves only as we are inwardly affected, and this would seem to be contradictory, since we should then have to be in a passive relation of active affection to ourselves. It is to avoid this contradiction that in systems of psychology, inner sense, which we have carefully distinguished from the faculty of apperception, is commonly regarded as being identical with it. What determines inner sense is the understanding and its original power of combining the manifold of intuition, that is, of bringing it under an apperception, upon which the possibility of understanding itself rests. Now, the understanding in us men is not itself a faculty of intuitions, and cannot, even if intuitions be given in sensibility, take them up into itself in such a manner as to combine them as the manifold of its own intuition. Its synthesis, therefore, if the synthesis be viewed by itself alone, is nothing but the unity of the act, of which, as an act, it is conscious to itself, even without the aid of sensibility, but through which it is yet able to determine the sensibility. The understanding, that is to say, in respect of the manifold, which may be given to it in accordance with the form of a sensible intuition, is able to determine sensibility inwardly. Thus the understanding, under the title of a transcendental synthesis of imagination, performs this act upon the passive subject, whose faculty it is, and we are therefore justified in saying that inner sense is affected thereby. Apperception and its synthetic unity is, indeed, very far from being identical with inner sense. The former, as the source of all combination, applies to the manifold of intuitions in general, and in the guise of the categories, prior to all sensible intuition, to objects in general. Inner sense, on the other hand, contains the mere form of intuition, but without combination of the manifold in it, and therefore so far contains no determinate intuition, which is possible only through the consciousness of the determination of the manifold by the transcendental act of imagination, synthetic influence of the understanding upon inner sense, which I have entitled figurative synthesis. This we can always perceive in ourselves. We cannot think a line without drawing it in thought, or a circle without describing it. We cannot represent the three dimensions of space save by setting 3 points at right angles to one another from the same point. Even time itself we cannot represent, save insofar as we attend in the drawing of a straight line, which has to serve as the outer figurative representation of time, merely to the act of the synthesis of the manifold, whereby we successively determine inner sense, and in so doing attend to the succession of this determination in inner sense. Motion as an act of the subject, not as a determination of an object. Footnote: motion of an object in space does not belong to a pure science, and consequently not to geometry. For the fact that something is movable cannot be known a priori, but only through experience. Motion, however, considered as the describing of a space, is a pure act of the successive synthesis of the manifold in outer intuition in general by means of the productive imagination, and belongs not only to geometry, but even to transcendental philosophy. And therefore the synthesis of the manifold in space first produces the concept of succession. If we abstract from this manifold and attend solely to the act through which we determine the inner sense according to its form, the understanding does not, therefore, find in inner sense such a combination of the manifold but produces it, in that it affects that sense. How the I that thinks can be distinct from the I that intuits itself, for I can represent still other modes of intuition as at least possible, and yet, as being the same subject, can be identical with the latter, and how, therefore, I can say, I, as intelligence and thinking subject, know myself as an object that is thought, insofar as I am likewise given to myself in intuition, but know myself, like other phenomena, only as I appear to myself, not as I am to the understanding. These are questions that raise no greater nor less difficulty than how I can be an object to myself at all, and more particularly an object of intuition and of inner perceptions. Indeed, that this is how it must be is easily shown, if we admit that space is merely a pure form of the appearances of outer sense, by the fact that we cannot obtain for ourselves a representation of time, which is not an object of outer intuition, except under the image of a line, which we draw, and that by this mode of depicting it alone could we know the singleness of its dimensions, and similarly by the fact that for all inner perceptions we must derive the determination of lengths of time, or of points of time, from the changes which are exhibited to us in outer things, and that the determinations of inner sense have therefore to be arranged as appearances in time, in precisely the same manner in which we arrange those of outer sense in space. If, then, as regards the latter, we admit that we know objects only insofar as we are externally affected, we must also recognize, as regards inner sense, that by means of it we intuit ourselves only as we are inwardly affected by ourselves. In other words, that so far as inner intuition is concerned, we know our own subject only as appearance, not as it is in itself. Footnote: I do not see why so much difficulty should be found in admitting that our inner sense is affected by ourselves. Such affection finds exemplification in each and every act of attention. In every act of attention, the understanding determines inner sense, in accordance with the combination which it thinks, to that inner intuition which corresponds to the manifold in the synthesis of the understanding. How much the mind is usually thereby affected, everyone will be able to perceive in himself. On the other hand, in the transcendental synthesis of the manifold of representations in general, and therefore in the synthetic original unity of apperception, I am conscious of myself, not as I appear to myself, nor as I am in myself, but only that I am. This representation is a thought, not an intuition. Now, in order to know ourselves, there is required, in addition to the act of thought, which brings the manifold of every possible intuition to the unity of apperception, a determinate mode of intuition, whereby this manifold is given. It therefore follows that although my existence is not indeed appearance, still less mere illusion, the determination of my existence. Footnote: the I think expresses the act of determining my existence. Existence is already given thereby, but the mode in which I am to determine this existence, that is, the manifold belonging to it, is not thereby given. In order that it be given, self-intuition is required, and such intuition is conditioned by a given a priori form, namely time, which is sensible and belongs to the receptivity of the determinable, in me. Now, since I do not have another self-intuition which gives the determining in me, I am conscious only of the spontaneity of it prior to the act of determination, as time does in the case of the determinable. I cannot determine my existence as that of a self-active being. All that I can do is to represent to myself the spontaneity of my thought, that is, of the determination, and my existence is still only determinable sensibly, that is, as the existence of an appearance. But it is owing to this spontaneity that I entitle myself an intelligence. Can take place only in conformity with the form of inner sense, according to the special mode in which the manifold, which I combine, is given in inner intuition. Accordingly, I have no knowledge of myself as I am, but merely as I appear to myself. The consciousness of self is thus very far from being a knowledge of the self, notwithstanding all the categories which are being employed to constitute the thought of an object in general, through combination of the manifold in one apperception. Just as for knowledge of an object distinct from me, I require, besides the thought of an object in general, in the category, an intuition by which I determine that general concept. So for knowledge of myself, I require, besides the consciousness, that is, besides the thought of myself, an intuition of the manifold in me, by which I determine this thought. I exist as an intelligence which is conscious solely of its power of combination. But in respect of the manifold which it has to combine, I am subjected to a limiting condition, entitled inner sense, namely that this combination can be made intuitable only according to relations of time, which lie entirely outside the concepts of understanding, strictly regarded. Such an intelligence, therefore, can know itself only as it appears to itself in respect of an intuition which is not intellectual and cannot be given by the understanding itself, not as it would know itself if its intuition were intellectual. Transcendental deduction of the universally possible employment in experience of the pure concepts of the understanding. In the metaphysical deduction, the a priori origin of the categories has been proved through their complete agreement with the general logical functions of thought. In the transcendental deduction, we have shown their possibility as a priori modes of knowledge of objects of an intuition in general. We have now to explain the possibility of knowing a priori, by means of categories, whatever objects may present themselves to our senses, not indeed in respect of the form of their intuition, but in respect of the laws of their combination, and so, as it were, of prescribing laws to nature, and even of making nature possible. For unless the categories discharged this function, there could be no explaining why everything that can be presented to our senses must be subject to laws which have their origin a priori in the understanding alone. First of all, I may draw attention to the fact that by synthesis of apprehension, I understand that combination of the manifold in an empirical intuition, whereby perception, that is, empirical consciousness of the intuition as appearance, is possible. In the representations of space and time, we have a priori forms of outer and inner sensible intuition, and to these the synthesis of apprehension of the manifold of appearance must always conform, because in no other way can the synthesis take place at all. But space and time are represented a priori not merely as forms of sensible intuition, but as themselves intuitions which contain a manifold of their own, and therefore are represented with the determination of the unity of this manifold. See the Transcendental Aesthetic. Footnote: space, represented as object, as we're required to do in geometry, contains more than mere form of intuition. It also contains combination of the manifold, given according to the form of sensibility, and an intuitive representation, so that the form of intuition gives only a manifold, the formal intuition gives unity of representation. In the aesthetic, I have treated this unity as belonging merely to sensibility, simply in order to emphasize that it precedes any concept, although, as a matter of fact, it presupposes a synthesis which does not belong to the senses, but through which all concepts of space and time first become possible. For since by its means, in that the understanding determines the sensibility, space and time are first given as intuitions, the unity of this a priori intuition belongs to space and time, and not to the concept of the understanding. Thus, unity of the synthesis of the manifold, without or within us, and consequently also a combination to which everything that is to be represented as determined in space or in time must conform, is given a priori as the condition of the synthesis of all apprehension, not indeed in, but with these conditions. This synthetic unity can be no other than the unity of the combination of the manifold of a given intuition in general in an original consciousness, in accordance with the categories, insofar as the combination is applied to our sensible intuition. All synthesis, therefore, even that which renders perception possible, is subject to the categories. And since experience is knowledge by means of connected perceptions, the categories are conditions of the possibility of experience, and are therefore valid a priori for all objects of experience. When, for instance, by apprehension of the manifold of a house, I make the empirical intuition of it into a perception, the necessary unity of space and of outer sensible intuition in general lies at the basis of my apprehension, and I draw, as it were, the outline of the house in conformity with the synthetic unity of the manifold in space. But if I abstract from the form of space, this same synthetic unity has its seat in the understanding, and is the category of the synthesis of the homogeneous in an intuition in general, that is, the category of quantity. To this category, therefore, the synthesis of apprehension, that is to say, the perception, must completely conform. Footnote: in this manner it is proved that the synthesis of apprehension, which is empirical, must necessarily be in conformity with the synthesis of apperception, which is intellectual and is contained in the category completely a priori. It is one and the same spontaneity, which in the one case under the title of imagination, and in the other case under the title of understanding, brings combination into the manifold of intuition. When, to take another example, I perceive the freezing of water, I apprehend two states, fluidity and solidity, and these as standing to one another in a relation of time. But in time, which I place at the basis of the appearance, insofar as it is inner intuition, I necessarily represent to myself synthetic unity of the manifold, without which that relation of time could not be given in an intuition as being determined in respect of time sequence. Now this synthetic unity, as a condition a priori under which I combine the manifold of an intuition in general, is, if I abstract from the constant form of my inner intuition, namely time, the category of cause, by means of which, when I apply it to my sensibility, I determine everything that happens in accordance with the relation which it prescribes, and I do so in time in general. Thus my apprehension of such an event, and therefore the event itself, considered as a possible perception, is subject to the concept of the relation of effects and causes, and so in all other cases. Categories are concepts which prescribe laws a priori to appearances, and therefore to nature, the sum of all appearances. The question therefore arises how it can be conceivable that nature should have to proceed in accordance with categories which yet are not derived from it, and do not model themselves upon its pattern. That is, how they can determine a priori the combination of the manifold of nature, while yet they are not derived from it. The solution of this seeming enigma is as follows: that the laws of appearances in nature must agree with the understanding and its a priori form, that is, with its faculty of combining the manifold in general, is no more surprising than that the appearances themselves must agree with the form of a priori sensible intuition. For just as appearances do not exist in themselves, but only relatively to the subject in which, so far as it has senses, they inhere, so the laws do not exist in the appearances, but only relatively to the same being, so far as it has understanding. Things in themselves would necessarily, apart from any understanding that knows them, conform to laws of their own. But appearances are only representations of things which are unknown as regards what they may be in themselves. As mere representations, they are subject to no law of connection save that which the connecting faculty prescribes. Now, it is imagination that connects the manifold of sensible intuition, and imagination is dependent for the unity of its intellectual synthesis upon the understanding, and for the manifoldness of its apprehension upon sensibility. All possible perception is thus dependent upon synthesis of apprehension, and this empirical synthesis, in turn, upon transcendental synthesis, and therefore upon the categories. Consequently, all possible perceptions, and therefore everything that can come to empirical consciousness, that is, all appearances of nature, must, so far as their connection is concerned, be subject to the categories. Nature, considered merely as nature in general, is dependent upon these categories as the original ground of its necessary conformity to law. Pure understanding is not, however, in a position, through mere categories, to prescribe to appearances any a priori laws other than those which are involved in a nature in general, that is, in the conformity to law of all appearances in space and time. Special laws, as concerning those appearances which are empirically determined, cannot in their specific character be derived from the categories, although they are one and all subject to them. To obtain any knowledge whatsoever of these special laws, we must resort to experience. But it is the a priori laws that alone can instruct us in regard to experience in general, and as to what it is that can be known as an object of experience. Outcome of this deduction of the concepts of understanding. We cannot think an object save through categories. We cannot know an object, so thought, save through intuitions corresponding to these concepts. Now, all our intuitions are sensible, and this knowledge, insofar as its object is given, is empirical. But empirical knowledge is experience. Consequently, there can be no a priori knowledge except of objects of possible experience. Footnote. Lest my readers should stumble at the alarming evil consequences which may over hastily be inferred from this statement, I may remind them that for thought, the categories are not limited by the conditions of our sensible intuition, but have an unlimited field. It is only the knowledge of that which we think, the determining of the object, that requires intuition. In the absence of intuition, the thought of the object may still have its true and useful consequences, as regards the subject's employment of reason. The use of reason is not always directed to the determination of the object, that is, to knowledge, but also to the determination of the subject and of its volition, a use which cannot therefore be here dealt with. But although this knowledge is limited to objects of experience, it is not therefore all derived from experience. The pure intuitions of receptivity and the pure concepts of understanding are elements in knowledge, and both are found in us a priori. There are only two ways in which we can account for a necessary agreement of experience with the concepts of its objects. Either experience makes these concepts possible, or these concepts make experience possible. The former supposition does not hold in respect of the categories, nor of pure sensible intuition. For since they are a priori concepts, and therefore independent of experience, the ascription to them of an empirical origin would be a sort of generatio equivoca. There remains, therefore, only the second supposition, a system, as it were, of the epigenesis of pure reason, namely, that the categories contain, on the side of the understanding, the grounds of the possibility of all experience in general. How they make experience possible, and what are the principles of the possibility of experience that they supply in their application to appearances, will be shown more fully in the following chapter on the transcendental employment of the faculty of judgment. A middle course may be proposed between the two above mentioned, namely, that the categories are neither self-thought first principles a priori of our knowledge, nor derived from experience, but subjective dispositions of thought, implanted in us from the first moment of our existence, and so ordered by our Creator that their employment is in complete harmony with the laws of nature, in accordance with which experience proceeds, a kind of preformation system of pure reason. Apart, however, from the objection that on such a hypothesis we can set no limit to the assumption of predetermined dispositions to future judgments, there is this decisive objection against the suggested middle course, that the necessity of the categories, which belongs to their very conception, would then have to be sacrificed. The concept of cause, for instance, which expresses the necessity of an event under a presupposed condition, would be false if it rested only on an arbitrary subjective necessity, implanted in us, of connecting certain empirical representations according to the rule of causal relation. I would not then be able to say that the effect is connected with the cause in the object, that is to say, necessarily, but only that I am so constituted that I cannot think this representation otherwise than as thus connected. This is exactly what the skeptic most desires. For if this be the situation, all our insight, resting on the supposed objective validity of our judgments, is nothing but sheer illusion. Nor would there be wanting people who would refuse to admit this subjective necessity, a necessity which can only be felt. Certainly, a man cannot dispute with anyone regarding that which depends merely on the mode in which he is himself organized. Brief outline of this deduction. The deduction is the exposition of the pure concepts of the understanding, and therewith of all theoretical a priori knowledge, as principles of the possibility of experience, the principles being here taken as the determination of appearances in space and time in general, and this determination, in turn, as ultimately following from the original synthetic unity of apperception, as the form of the understanding in its relation to space and time, the original forms of sensibility. I consider the division by numbered paragraphs as necessary up to this point, because thus far we have had to treat of the elementary concepts. We have now to give an account of their employment, and the exposition may therefore proceed in continuous fashion, without such numbering.